Title: The Shadows of the Forest. Luke had always taken the same path through the forest on his way home from his best friend's house. The towering trees had once seemed comforting, their thick branches shielding him from the sun. He used to think of the forest as a friend, a silent guardian that watched over his childhood adventures. But lately, that feeling had changed. The forest had grown darker, as though a shadow had fallen over it. The once cheerful rustle of leaves now sounded like whispers, and the comforting shade of the trees seemed to hide things that shouldn't be seen. The air had turned cold, colder than it should be in the middle of summer, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. At first he tried to ignore it, convincing himself that his imagination was getting the better of him. He told himself that the sudden chills, the shifting shadows, and the strange sounds were nothing more than tricks of the mind. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to believe his own reassurances. The rules were simple, or so he thought. Stay calm, don't run, and don't scream. It was as if some primal instinct had whispered these rules to him, a survival guide against the unseen danger that lurked in the forest. He didn't know why he felt the need to follow them, but he did. And yet the weight of those rules had started to suffocate him. He could feel the thing in the forest, a presence, unseen but always there, just at the edge of his senses. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a feeling that gnawed at the back of his mind, growing stronger with each passing day. Every time he walked that path, he felt its gaze burning into the back of his neck, waiting for him to falter. He tried not to look over his shoulder, tried not to acknowledge the feeling. He thought that if he ignored it, maybe it would go away. But the presence was persistent. It was patient. It knew that eventually he would slip. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Luke found himself running late. The forest was different at night, and he knew he had to hurry. The shadows under the trees seemed to deepen, swallowing the last bits of daylight, and the air grew colder still. Luke wrapped his arms around himself, trying to keep warm, but it was no use. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. The path was narrow, winding its way through the thickest part of the forest. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The deeper Luke went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang, no insects chirped. The only sound was the crunch of his footsteps on the fallen leaves, and even that seemed muted, as though the forest was swallowing the noise. Luke's heart began to pound, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. He could feel it, the presence, closer now, watching him from the shadows. He glanced around, his eyes darting from one dark shape to another, but there was nothing there. He tried to calm himself, to focus on the path ahead, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could feel his skin prickling with fear. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the leaves. "Don't run. Don't scream." The words were like a mantra, something to hold on to as the darkness closed in around him. But the deeper he went, the harder it became to follow his own advice. He could feel his fear building, a knot tightening in his stomach, his muscles tensing, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Suddenly, Luke heard a noise, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes scanning the darkness. The rustling grew louder, coming from somewhere to his left, just beyond the edge of the path. Luke's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sound. He squinted into the darkness, trying to see what was there, but all he could make out were the dark shapes of the trees. "Hello!" he called out, his voice trembling. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Luke held his breath, waiting, listening. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. A shadow, slipping between the trees, too quick to make out. He turned, his eyes wide, but it was gone. The forest was still again, the air thick with tension. Luke took a step back, his heart racing, his mind screaming at him to run, but he knew he couldn't. He had to stay calm, had to follow the rules. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the fear was overwhelming. He could feel it. Something was out there, something that shouldn't be. It was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He turned back to the path, forcing himself to keep moving, his steps quickening as he tried to put distance between himself and whatever was out there. The shadows seemed to shift and move around him, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder still, the chill biting into his skin, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Luke's mind was a blur, his thoughts tangled with fear and confusion. He needed to get out of the forest, needed to reach the safety of his home. But the path seemed longer than he remembered. The trees taller, the shadows darker. It was as if the forest itself was changing, twisting around him, trying to trap him within its depths. The rustling came again, this time from behind him, and Luke couldn't help himself. He turned, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. He saw it then, a shape, dark and indistinct, slipping between the trees, moving toward him. It was tall, its limbs long and thin, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Luke's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen with fear. The thing moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it knew there was no need to hurry. Luke could feel its gaze on him, could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him. His legs trembled, his hands clenched into fists, his mind screaming at him to run, to get away. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed, trapped by the thing's gaze, by the darkness that seemed to wrap around him like a shroud. The whispers started then, soft and indistinguishable at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, the words twisting around his mind, urging him to come closer, to step off the path and into the shadows. Luke shook his head, his eyes wide with fear, his heart pounding. He couldn't listen to them. He had to stay calm. He had to follow the rules. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more demanding, filling his mind until there was no room for anything else. The thing in the shadows moved closer, its eyes locked on his, its presence overwhelming. Luke could feel his resolve crumbling, could feel the fear taking over. He needed to get away. He needed to run. With a sudden burst of movement, Luke turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the forest, the shadows rushing past him. The whispers turned into screams, the thing behind him moving faster now, the air around him growing colder, the darkness closing in. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind a blur of panic and fear. The path twisted and turned, the trees blurring together as Luke ran, his legs burning, his lungs aching. He could hear the thing behind him, could feel its presence growing closer, could feel the cold seeping into his bones. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell, crashing to the ground, his hands scraping against the rough earth. For a moment, Luke lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling. He could feel the thing behind him, could feel its gaze on him, its presence overwhelming. He knew he had broken the rules. He had run, and now it was going to catch him. Slowly, Luke pushed himself up, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with fear. He turned, his heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. The thing was there, standing at the edge of the path, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, its limbs long and thin, its presence suffocating. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. Luke stared at it, his heart pounding, his mind filled with terror. He knew he couldn't run again. He had to face it, had to stay calm. He took a deep breath, his body trembling, his hands clenched into fists. He stared into the thing's eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to give in to the fear. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, the forest silent around them, the air cold and still. The thing didn't move, its eyes locked on Luke's, its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. But Luke didn't look away. He held his ground, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, the thing seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, the darkness around it shifting. Slowly it began to fade, the shadows swallowing it, the cold lifting, the air growing warmer. Luke watched as it disappeared, the whispers fading, the presence retreating. He took a deep breath, his body trembling, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and relief. He had faced it. He had followed the rules, and for now, he was safe. But as Luke stood there, the forest still and silent around him, he knew that this was far from over. The thing was still out there, waiting, watching. And the next time he walked this path, it would be waiting for him. Luke turned, his heart heavy, his body trembling, and he began to walk, his footsteps echoing through the forest, the shadows still shifting around him. He knew that he couldn't avoid the path forever. He knew that one day he would have to face the thing again. And when that day came, he would be ready, or so he hoped. Chapter 2. A Scarred Memory. Luke's fear was palpable as he sat at the kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the window, casting soft shadows on the floor. His arm throbbed, the fresh gashes wrapped in a hasty bandage. His mother had dismissed it as an accident, a scrape he'd gotten from tripping over a root in the dark. But Luke knew the truth. He could still feel the presence of the thing in the forest, the way its eyes had burned into him, the weight of its gaze pressing him to the ground. The memory haunted him. He replayed the events in his mind over and over again. The forest, the darkness, the whispers, and the thing that had come for him. The terror of it gripped him still, a fear that seemed to wrap itself around his very soul, refusing to let go. He knew it wasn't his imagination. He knew it was real, but how could he convince anyone else of that? Even his parents thought it was just a story, the result of an overactive imagination and the deepening twilight of the forest. Luke's father walked into the kitchen, glancing at his son's bandaged arm. "You need to be more careful out there, Luke. The forest can be dangerous, especially at night," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of concern and exasperation. Luke just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He knew that nothing he could say would make a difference. No one believed him. The presence in the forest was his burden to bear alone. The next few days were a blur of fear and unease. Luke tried to avoid the forest path, but it was nearly impossible. It was the fastest route to his best friend Sarah's house, and the long way around would add almost an hour to his walk. Still, he found excuses to stay at Sarah's longer, hoping his parents would come pick him up, but they were often too busy. Eventually, he knew he would have to face the path again. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Sarah watched Luke with a frown as he glanced nervously out the window. "Are you okay, Luke?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You've been acting strange lately, like you're scared of something." She paused, her eyes scanning his face. "Is it the forest?" Luke hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. He wanted to tell her everything, the whispers, the thing in the shadows, the rules that had kept him safe until he had broken them. But the words caught in his throat, the fear tightening around him like a vice. "It's nothing," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Just, I don't like walking home in the dark." Sarah frowned, her eyes narrowing. "You know you can tell me, right? If something's wrong, I'll listen." She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm, her eyes filled with concern. Luke swallowed, his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to tell her, wanted to share the burden that was weighing on him, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He was too afraid, afraid that she wouldn't believe him, afraid that talking about it would make it more real. Instead, he just nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be okay." He stood, grabbing his backpack and slinging it over his shoulder. "I should get going. It's getting late." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she just nodded, her eyes still filled with worry. "Be careful, okay?" she said, her voice soft. Luke gave her a small smile, turning toward the door. "I will," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. As Luke stepped out of Sarah's house and onto the path leading to the forest, his heart began to pound in his chest. The sun was sinking lower, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. But the forest ahead was dark, the shadows deepening with every passing moment. He hesitated at the edge of the trees, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his eyes scanning the darkness. The rules echoed in his mind. Stay calm, don't run, don't scream. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to gather his courage. He had no choice. He had to walk the path. He took a step forward, then another, the trees closing in around him, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. The air was cold, colder than it should be for a summer evening, and Luke could feel the presence again, the same one that had haunted him days before. He could feel it watching him, its gaze burning into the back of his neck, just waiting for him to make a mistake. He tried to focus on the path ahead, on the way home, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. The whispers started again, soft and indistinguishable, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the fear building, a knot tightening in his stomach. He tried to stay calm, tried to follow the rules, but it was so hard. The whispers seemed to be all around him, echoing through the forest, growing louder, more insistent. "Luke!" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it made his blood run cold. He froze, his eyes wide, his heart pounding in his ears. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, shifting between the trees. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the fear was overwhelming. He could feel the presence, closer now, the whispers growing louder, wrapping around his mind. "Luke!" The voice came again, closer this time, a chill running down his spine. He turned again, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He could see something moving between the trees, a dark shape slipping through the darkness. His heart pounded, his hands trembling. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but he knew he couldn't. He had to stay calm. He had to follow the rules. The thing moved closer, its form just barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, its limbs long and thin, its movements slow and deliberate. Luke's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen with fear. He could feel its gaze on him, could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him. His legs trembled, his mind screaming at him to run, but he knew he couldn't. He had to stay calm. He had to face it. "Luke!" The voice was right behind him now, and Luke could feel the cold breath on the back of his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the thing's presence, so close, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. He knew he had to face it, had to stay calm, but the fear was too much. Slowly, Luke turned, his eyes opening, his heart pounding. The thing was there, standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly, its limbs long and thin, its presence suffocating. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. Luke stared at it, his body trembling, his mind filled with terror. He knew he couldn't run. He had to face it, had to stay calm. The thing moved closer, its eyes locked on his, its presence pressing down on him. Luke could feel his heart pounding, could feel the fear consuming him, but he held his ground. He stared into its eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to give in to the fear. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, the forest silent around them, the air cold and still. Finally, the thing seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, the darkness around it shifting. Slowly it began to fade, the shadows swallowing it, the cold lifting, the air growing warmer. Luke watched as it disappeared, the whispers fading, the presence retreating. He took a deep breath, his body trembling, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and relief. He had faced it. He had followed the rules, and for now he was safe. Luke turned back to the path, his heart pounding, his body trembling. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing through the forest, the shadows still shifting around him. He knew that this was far from over. The thing was still out there, waiting, watching, and the next time he walked this path, it would be waiting for him. When he finally reached his house, he collapsed onto his bed, his body aching, his mind exhausted. He closed his eyes, trying to forget the forest, trying to forget the thing that had come for him, but the whispers still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder that he was never truly alone. The next day, Luke woke to find Sarah waiting for him outside. Her eyes widened when she saw him, the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion etched into his face. "Luke, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Luke hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He had to tell someone. He had to tell Sarah. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "There's something in the forest, Sarah," he said, his voice trembling. "Something that's watching me, and I don't know how to stop it." Sarah's eyes widened, her face paling. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "We'll figure it out, Luke," she said, her voice steady, her eyes filled with determination. "You're not alone. We'll face it together." And for the first time in days, Luke felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. He had Sarah. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to face the darkness together. Chapter 3. A companion in mystery. Luke couldn't shake the lingering fear from the forest, but Sarah's presence gave him strength. He had finally told her everything, and though her face had gone pale as she listened, her eyes never wavered. She believed him, truly believed him, and that belief was the anchor he needed. Sarah wasn't just his best friend now. She was his partner in this nightmare, the only person who shared his burden. The next morning, Luke and Sarah sat together on her porch, planning what to do next. The sky was overcast, casting a dull grey hue over everything, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah looked at Luke with a fierce determination that contrasted with the uncertainty he felt. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," she said, her voice steady. "If we're going to face it, we need to know what it wants." Luke nodded, though the thought of facing that presence again made his stomach twist. He remembered the whispers, the way they had wrapped around his mind, how they had almost made him step off the path. He knew it wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was dangerous. But Sarah was right. They couldn't run from it forever. They needed answers. Sarah had an idea. She suggested they visit the village library. It was an old building, one that had stood for over a century, and its shelves were filled with books about local history, myths, and legends. If anyone had ever encountered something like the thing in the forest before, maybe there would be a record of it somewhere. Maybe they could find a clue about what it was and how to stop it. The library was quiet when they arrived, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, greeted them as they walked in. "Looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she didn't want to disturb the silence of the place. Sarah hesitated, glancing at Luke before speaking. "We're looking for information about the forest," she said carefully. "Any legends or stories about strange things happening there?" The librarian's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze sharpening. "The forest?" she repeated, her voice almost cautious. "You're not planning on going in there, are you?" Luke shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am, we're just curious. We've heard some stories and wanted to learn more." The librarian studied them for a moment longer before nodding. "There are some old records in the back, near the local history section," she said, pointing them in the right direction. "Be careful what you go looking for, though. Some things are better left alone." Luke felt a chill run down his spine at her words, but he nodded, giving her a small smile. "Thank you," he said, and together he and Sarah made their way to the back of the library, where the oldest books were kept. The shelves were tall and narrow, filled with dusty tomes and brittle pages. Sarah pulled out a book titled Legends of Black Hollow, its cover worn and faded. She opened it, the pages yellowed with age, and began to read aloud. The stories were strange, tales of spirits and shadows, of people who had gone missing in the forest, never to be seen again. Luke listened, his heart pounding in his chest. The descriptions were eerily similar to what he had experienced. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, the way the forest seemed to come alive at night. He leaned over Sarah's shoulder, his eyes scanning the words as she read. "It's like it knows," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It knows when you're afraid. It wants you to run. It wants you to leave the path." Sarah nodded, her eyes focused on the page. "It feeds on fear," she said, her voice soft. "That's why it wants you to break the rules. It wants you to be afraid. to give in. She looked up at Luke, her eyes filled with determination. We can't let it win, Luke. We have to face it, together. Luke swallowed, his throat dry. He nodded, though his hands were trembling. He knew she was right, but the thought of going back into the forest, of facing that presence again, filled him with dread. Still, he couldn't do this alone. He needed Sarah, and she was willing to stand by him, no matter how terrifying the journey ahead might be. They spent hours in the library, poring over old books and records, searching for anything that might help them understand what they were dealing with. The sun had long since disappeared behind the thick clouds, and the library had grown dim, the only light coming from the lamps on the tables. The librarian had checked on them a few times, her eyes wary, but she hadn't said anything more about their search. Finally, Sarah found something, a passage in an old journal, written by a man who had lived in the village over 100 years ago. He had written about the forest, about something he called the Watcher. The description was chillingly familiar. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched. He had written about how the Watcher seemed to feed on fear, how it would try to lure people off the path, into the darkness. But there was more. The man had written about a way to protect oneself from the Watcher. He had mentioned symbols, runes that could be carved into the ground, markings that would keep the Watcher at bay. Luke felt a spark of hope as he read the words, his eyes widening. Maybe this is it, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. Maybe this is how we can stop it. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the page. We need to find these symbols, she said, her voice steady. If we can carve them along the path, maybe we can keep it away. Maybe we can make the forest safe again. Luke took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he traced the symbols in the journal. He could feel the fear bubbling up inside him, the memory of the Watcher's gaze, the whispers that had filled his mind. But he also felt something else, a sense of determination, a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone. He had Sarah, and together they would face this darkness. They copied the symbols from the journal, carefully sketching them onto a piece of paper. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the strange markings, the lines and curves that seemed almost to pulse with energy. He didn't know if it would work, but it was a chance to fight back, to take control. As they left the library, the sky had grown dark, the wind picking up, rustling the leaves in the trees. Luke and Sarah walked side by side, the piece of paper clutched tightly in Luke's hand. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but he tried to push it aside. They had a plan now. They had a way to fight back. They reached the edge of the forest, the path stretching out before them, dark and foreboding. Luke hesitated, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could feel it, the presence, waiting for him, just beyond the edge of his vision. He looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with determination, her hand resting on his arm. We can do this, Luke, she said, her voice steady. We're going to face it together. Luke nodded, taking a deep breath. He unfolded the piece of paper, his eyes scanning the symbols they had copied from the journal. He could feel the fear, the dread, but he also felt a spark of hope. Slowly, he knelt at the edge of the path, his hands trembling as he began to carve the first symbol into the dirt. The forest seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up, the shadows shifting around them. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. He could feel the presence closer now, the whispers starting to echo through the trees. But he kept going, his hands moving steadily, carving each symbol into the earth, one after another. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands steady as she helped him carve the runes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the darkness pressing in around them, but they didn't stop. They worked together, their hands moving quickly, their hearts pounding. The symbols began to take shape, a line of protection along the path, a barrier against the darkness. Finally, they were done. Luke stood, his body trembling, his eyes scanning the forest. The whispers had grown silent, the presence retreating, the air growing warmer. He looked at Sarah, her eyes meeting his, a small smile playing on her lips. We did it, she said, her voice filled with hope. Luke nodded, his heart pounding. his mind filled with a mixture of fear and relief. They had faced the darkness, and for now, they had won. The forest was still and silent around them, the path marked with the symbols they had carved. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they had taken the first step. They had fought back, and they had survived. As they turned and walked away from the forest, the wind rustling through the trees, Luke felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fear was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. He had Sarah, and together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. The Watcher was still out there, waiting, watching. But Luke knew that he wasn't alone. He had a companion in mystery, a partner in the fight against the darkness, and together they would find a way to end it once and for all. Chapter 4: The Ascent. The day dawned with an eerie silence. It was as if the entire world knew what Luke and Sarah were planning, and it was holding its breath. The sky was a steel grey, and the sun remained hidden behind thick, oppressive clouds. Luke could feel the tension building inside him, a tight knot of fear that sat in the pit of his stomach, refusing to budge. They met at Sarah's house, their preparations complete. Sarah had packed a bag with supplies, food, water, flashlights, and, most importantly, the paper with the symbols they had copied from the old journal. Luke had brought a knife to carve the symbols, as well as a handful of candles, just in case they needed more light. They were ready, or at least, as ready as they could be. Sarah's parents were gone for the day, and they had left a note saying they were going for a walk. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. They weren't just going for a walk. They were going to confront the darkness, to challenge the presence that had haunted Luke for so long. As they set out, Luke could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the bag strap. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, the path disappearing into the shadows. Luke hesitated at the edge, his breath catching in his throat, his mind flashing back to the last time he had been here. The whispers, the cold, the thing that had followed him. He could feel the fear bubbling up inside him, the urge to turn back, to run. But then he felt Sarah's hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his, filled with determination. "We can do this, Luke," she said, her voice steady, her grip on his arm firm. "We're going to face it, and we're going to win." Luke took a deep breath, nodding. He knew she was right. They couldn't back down now. They had come too far, learned too much. Together, they stepped onto the path, the forest closing in around them, the air growing colder with every step. The deeper they went, the quieter the world seemed to become. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, were absent. It was as if the forest itself was waiting, watching, just like the presence that lurked in its depths. Luke could feel it, just beyond his vision, a dark shape slipping between the trees, always there, always waiting. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that covered the ground. The air grew colder, and Luke could see his breath in front of him, misting in the chill. The presence was stronger now, closer, and he could feel its gaze burning into his back. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustling of the wind, but growing louder, more insistent with every step. Sarah stopped suddenly, her hand gripping Luke's arm, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Luke nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear it, the whispers, calling his name, urging him to step off the path, to leave the safety of the symbols they had carved. He could feel the pull, a strange compulsion to obey, to step into the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind, to focus on the path ahead. "We have to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't let it get to us. Remember the symbols. They're our protection." Luke nodded, swallowing against the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He took a deep breath, his hand reaching into his bag to pull out the knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and he gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. Together, they continued down the path, the whispers growing louder, the presence pressing in around them, suffocating. Finally, they reached the clearing. It was a small open space, surrounded by the twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to form a wall of shadows. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, its surface covered in moss and lichen. The air was cold, colder than it had been on the path, and Luke could feel the presence all around them, the whispers echoing through the trees, growing louder, more insistent. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is where we make our stand." Luke nodded, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the clearing. He could feel the fear, the dread, but he could also feel the determination that had brought him here. He wasn't going to run, not this time. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he knelt at the edge of the clearing, the knife poised above the ground. He began to carve the first symbol into the earth, the blade biting into the cold, hard ground. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, the presence pressing in around them, the air growing colder still. He could feel it, closer now, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, to falter. But he didn't stop. He kept carving, his hands moving steadily, each line, each curve, forming the symbols they had found in the old journal. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she began to carve the symbols as well. The air seemed to grow heavier, the darkness pressing in, the whispers turning into screams, but they didn't stop. They worked together, their hands moving quickly, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The ground seemed to pulse beneath their hands, the symbols glowing faintly as they carved them, the lines shimmering with an otherworldly light. Luke could feel the presence growing angrier, the air vibrating with its fury. The shadows around them seemed to shift and writhe, the darkness growing deeper, but he kept going, his hands moving faster, carving each symbol with precision, each line a barrier against the darkness. Sarah's voice broke through the whispers, her words barely audible over the noise. "We're almost there, Luke. Just a few more." Her voice was filled with determination, a strength that seemed to cut through the fear, giving him the courage to keep going. Finally, they finished. The last symbol was carved into the ground, the line complete. The air seemed to still, the whispers falling silent, the presence retreating, the cold lifting. Luke took a deep breath, his body trembling, his hands aching from the effort. He looked up at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide, but a small smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." Luke nodded, his heart pounding, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They had faced the darkness, and for now, they had won. The clearing was still, the air no longer cold, the shadows no longer shifting. The symbols they had carved glowed faintly, a barrier against the presence that had haunted them for so long. But Luke knew it wasn't over. The presence was still out there, waiting, watching. This was just one battle, and there would be more to come. But for now, they had taken a stand. They had fought back, and they had survived. Sarah stood, her body trembling, her eyes meeting Luke's. She held out her hand, and he took it, his fingers wrapping around hers, the warmth of her touch grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the fear that still lingered in his mind. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We've done what we can here. We need to get back." Luke nodded, standing beside her, his eyes scanning the clearing one last time. The symbols glowed softly, a reminder of the battle they had fought, the victory they had won. He took a deep breath, turning away from the clearing, his hand still holding Sarah's, and together they walked back toward the path. The forest was still and silent around them, the air no longer cold, the presence no longer pressing in on them. Luke could feel the fear still there, just beneath the surface, but it was no longer overwhelming. He had faced the darkness and he had won, and he knew, deep down, that he could do it again if he had to. As they reached the edge of the forest, the sky beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn, Luke felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He looked at Sarah, her face tired but filled with determination, and he knew that he wasn't alone. They had faced the darkness together, and they would continue to fight it, no matter what. The Watcher was still out there, waiting, watching, but Luke and Sarah were ready. They had faced the darkness once, and they would do it again. And as long as they were together, Luke knew they could win. and for the first time in what felt like forever, Luke allowed himself to believe that they could end this, that they could find a way to banish the Watcher once and for all, and finally be free of the shadows that haunted them. Chapter 5. The Burned Crypt. The night passed in a blur of restless dreams, whispers echoing in the dark recesses of Luke's mind. He awoke to the first light of dawn, the remnants of the Watcher's presence still lingering like a cold mist in his thoughts. He sat up, sweat soaking his shirt, the fear from the previous day still clinging to him. But there was something else. A determination, a spark that refused to go out. They had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. Sarah arrived early, her face drawn and tired, but her eyes resolute. The symbols they had carved had held through the night, and while the clearing seemed safe, Luke and Sarah both knew they had to do more. The Watcher was relentless, and there was no telling what else it could do, how far it could reach. If they wanted to end this nightmare for good, they needed to find its source. They needed answers. The village library had offered them clues, but they needed more. Sarah had spent hours combing through the journal they had found, her eyes scanning the faded script for anything that might point them in the right direction. There was a passage she couldn't stop thinking about, an entry that spoke of an old crypt hidden deep within the forest, a place that had once been used by villagers long ago but had since been abandoned, left to decay. "This crypt," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper as she showed Luke the passage, her finger tracing the faded lines. "It might be the key. It says here that the villagers used it to trap something, a spirit, an entity that had haunted the forest. Maybe this is where the Watcher came from. Maybe this is where it can be ended." Luke felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words, his eyes scanning the passage. The thought of venturing even deeper into the forest, to a place that had been abandoned for a reason, filled him with dread. But he knew they didn't have a choice. They had to face it, to find the source of the Watcher's power, and destroy it once and for all. They set out at noon, the sun struggling to break through the thick clouds that had gathered overhead. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, as if the trees themselves were watching their every move. Luke could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of the Watcher's presence growing stronger with each step they took. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest, further from the safety of the village. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, rustling the leaves in the trees, the whispers beginning to echo through the branches. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he gripped the handle of the knife he had brought with him. He could feel the fear building, the same gnawing dread that had haunted him for days, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task ahead. Sarah led the way, her eyes scanning the forest, her steps steady and determined. She held the journal in her hands, the pages marked with notes, the symbols they had copied glowing faintly in the dim light. Luke followed close behind, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He could feel the presence, closer now, watching, waiting. After what felt like hours, they reached the entrance to the crypt. It was hidden beneath a thick tangle of vines and underbrush, the stone door weathered and cracked, almost invisible against the surrounding forest. Sarah knelt, her hands brushing away the dirt and leaves, revealing the ancient carvings etched into the stone, symbols that matched those they had copied from the journal. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "This is where it all began." Luke nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the cold seeping from the crypt, the air around them growing colder still, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He took a deep breath, his hand reaching out to touch the stone door. The surface was cold, almost painfully so, and as his fingers brushed against the carvings, he felt a jolt, a shock that shot through his body, leaving him breathless. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes wide, concern etched across her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," he said, his voice trembling. "Let's do this." Together, they pushed the stone door open, the heavy slab groaning as it moved, revealing a dark, yawning opening beyond. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else. something that made Luke's skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that seemed to seep into his very bones. Sarah turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow stone staircase leading down into the earth. Luke took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and stepped forward, the weight of the darkness pressing in around him. The stairs were steep, the walls close, and the air seemed to grow colder with each step they took, the whispers growing louder, echoing off the stone walls, surrounding them. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small chamber, the walls covered in carvings, the floor littered with broken stone and debris. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface blackened and cracked, as if it had been burned. The symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly in the dim light, the lines shimmering with a strange, otherworldly energy. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide as she scanned the chamber. "This is where they tried to trap it." Luke stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the altar. He could feel the presence, stronger now, pressing in around them, the whispers deafening, echoing in his mind. He could see the shadows shifting, writhing along the walls, the darkness growing deeper, the cold almost unbearable. Sarah knelt beside the altar, her hands trembling as she pulled out the paper with the symbols. "We have to carve these," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to strengthen the barrier, to seal it away." Luke nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands shaking as he pulled out the knife. He knelt beside Sarah, the blade poised above the stone, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the presence, closer now, the whispers echoing in his mind, urging him to stop, to leave, to run. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling, and began to carve the symbols into the stone. The blade bit into the surface, the lines glowing faintly as he worked, each cut, each curve forming a barrier against the darkness. The air seemed to vibrate, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, the presence pressing in on them, suffocating. Sarah worked beside him, her hands steady, her eyes focused on the task ahead. She could feel the fear, the dread, but she refused to let it control her. She carved each symbol with precision, her determination cutting through the darkness, pushing back against the whispers that filled the chamber. The ground seemed to pulse beneath them, the air vibrating with energy, the symbols glowing brighter, the lines shimmering with a light that seemed to push back against the shadows. Luke could feel the presence growing angrier, the darkness pressing in around them, the whispers turning into screams. Suddenly, a shadow moved, breaking free from the wall, a dark shape that seemed to shift and writhe, its form barely distinguishable. It moved toward them, its presence suffocating, the cold almost unbearable. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat, his hands trembling as he carved the last symbol. "Luke!" Sarah's voice broke through the chaos, her eyes wide, her face pale. "We have to finish this now." Luke nodded, his eyes fixed on the shadow as it moved closer, his hands moving faster, carving the last line, the symbol glowing brightly, the light cutting through the darkness. The shadow seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, the whispers turning into a deafening roar. With one final cut, the symbol was complete. The chamber seemed to explode with light, the symbols glowing brightly, the air vibrating with energy. The shadow let out a scream, its form writhing, shifting, before it was swallowed by the light, disappearing into the darkness. The air grew still, the whispers falling silent, the cold lifting. Luke took a deep breath, his body trembling, his hands aching from the effort. He looked at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide, but a smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with relief. Luke nodded, his heart pounding, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They had faced the darkness, and for now, they had won. The chamber was still, the air no longer cold, the shadows no longer shifting. The symbols they had carved glowed softly, a barrier against the presence that had haunted them for so long. But Luke knew it wasn't over. The Watcher was still out there, waiting, watching. This was just another battle, and there would be more to come. But they had taken another step, they had fought back, and they had survived. Sarah stood, her body trembling, her eyes meeting Luke's. She held out her hand, and he took it, the warmth of her touch grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the fear that still lingered in his mind. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice steady, her eyes filled with determination. "We've done what we can. It's time to go." Luke nodded, standing beside her, his eyes scanning the chamber one last time. The symbols glowed softly. A reminder. Chapter 6. The Whispering Woods days had passed since Luke's terrifying encounter in the forest, but the fear never truly left him. It lingered in the corners of his mind, an ever-present reminder that the shadows in the woods were not just figments of his imagination. His parents noticed his unease, but when they asked, he brushed off their concerns, unwilling to admit just how deeply the forest had scared him. The whispers had stopped, at least for a while, and Luke began to feel the tiniest hint of normalcy creeping back into his life. He stayed away from the path through the woods, taking the longer way home from his friend's house, sticking to the roads that wound through the village. He could see the forest from a distance, the dark line of trees standing against the horizon like silent watchers, and every time he caught a glimpse of them, his stomach churned with unease, but he couldn't avoid it forever. One Friday afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Luke found himself standing at the edge of the forest. His friends had dared him to take the path again, teasing him for his fear, unaware of the true horror that lurked among the trees. Luke's pride got the better of him. He couldn't let them think he was a coward, so he forced a smile and nodded, agreeing to walk the path alone. The moment he stepped into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop, the warmth of the day swallowed by the thick canopy above. Luke wrapped his arms around himself, feeling the cold seep into his skin. The path stretched ahead, winding through the towering trees, the shadows growing longer with every passing moment. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and began to walk. The silence was unnerving. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Luke's footsteps echoed in the stillness, each crunch of leaves and snap of twigs sounding unnaturally loud. He kept his eyes on the path, refusing to look at the shadows shifting at the edge of his vision. He knew they were there, watching, waiting. As he walked deeper, the familiar feeling returned, the weight of a presence, unseen but undeniable. It pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers started again, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around him, voices overlapping, urging him to come closer, to step off the path. Luke clenched his jaw, trying to ignore them. He repeated the rules in his head. Stay calm. Don't run. Don't scream. But the whispers were relentless, filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel his resolve crumbling, fear clawing at him, his steps faltering. Suddenly he heard it. A different sound, something that cut through the whispers. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Luke's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped, his eyes scanning the shadows, trying to find the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, and Luke felt a surge of panic. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. Something was stalking him. He took a step back, his eyes wide, his pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were warning him, urging him to run. Luke turned, his body trembling, and started to walk faster. His footsteps hurried, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The growl followed him, growing louder, more menacing, the sound reverberating through the trees. Luke broke into a run. He knew he shouldn't. He knew the rules. But the fear was too much, the presence too close. His feet pounded against the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the trees blurring around him. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the voices overlapping, screaming at him, but he couldn't make out the words. The path twisted and turned, the forest seeming to close in on him, the shadows reaching out like skeletal fingers. Luke's legs burned, his chest ached, but he didn't dare stop. He could feel it behind him, the growl growing louder, closer, the presence almost upon him. Just as he thought he couldn't go any further, Luke saw it, a light, faint but unmistakable, filtering through the trees. The edge of the forest. He pushed himself harder, his eyes locked on the light, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispers faded, the growl receding, the cold lifting as he burst out of the woods, stumbling onto the road. Luke fell to his knees, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back at the forest, the dark line of trees standing silent and still, the path disappearing into the shadows. The presence was gone, the whispers silenced, but Luke knew it was still there, waiting for him, watching. He had escaped, but only just, and as he got to his feet, his legs shaky, his heart heavy, Luke knew one thing for certain: the forest wasn't done with him yet. The shadows were still there, lurking, waiting for the moment he would slip. And the next time, he might not be so lucky. Chapter 7. Echoes in the dark. The whispers had come back. Luke tried to ignore them, tried to tell himself they were just a figment of his imagination, but they were relentless. No matter how hard he tried, they were always there, just beyond the edge of his senses, slipping into his thoughts when he let his guard down. They were patient, waiting for the moment his mind wandered, and then they would slip in, a chorus of voices that twisted his thoughts until he couldn't tell where they ended, and his own thoughts began. It was happening again now, as he walked down the path that wound through the village. The whispers were soft, barely audible, like a rustle of leaves in the wind. They called to him, urging him to come back to the forest. Luke shook his head, trying to drown them out. He focused on the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel road, the weight of his backpack on his shoulders, anything to keep his mind from slipping back to the forest. But the whispers persisted, their voices overlapping, twisting around his mind like vines, pulling him back. Luke's grip on the straps of his backpack tightened, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to push the whispers away. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. Luke stumbled, his breath catching in his throat, his heart pounding. The village was empty, the street stretching ahead, disappearing into the distance. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and Luke could feel the weight of the whispers pressing down on him, the presence of the forest always there, just out of reach. He looked up, his eyes wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed to get away, away from the whispers, away from the forest. He turned, his feet moving before his mind could catch up, his legs carrying him away from the village, away from the path, away from everything familiar. He could hear the whispers growing louder, overlapping, pulling at his thoughts, twisting them into something he couldn't understand. Luke ran, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The world around him blurred, his vision narrowing until there was only the path ahead, only the need to get away. He ran until his legs burned, until his breath came in short, sharp gasps, until his heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. The whispers grew louder still, like a storm building in the distance, until they were all Luke could hear. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell, his body crashing to the ground. He lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. The whispers surrounded him, pressing in on him from all sides, their voices overlapping, merging into a cacophony that filled his mind until there was no room for anything else. Luke pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The whispers were inside his head, wrapping around his thoughts, twisting them, turning them against him. He could feel them pulling him down, down into the darkness, into the shadows that waited just beyond the edge of his vision. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "No, no, no." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more demanding, their voices overlapping, echoing in his mind until he couldn't tell what was real and what was not. Luke closed his eyes, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, his hands still pressed to his ears. The world around him seemed to shift, the ground tilting beneath him, the air growing colder. The whispers twisted around his mind, pulling him deeper into the shadows, into the darkness that waited for him. And then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening, the absence of sound leaving an echo in Luke's mind. a void that seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. He opened his eyes, his hands falling to his sides, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around him had changed. The path was gone. The village was gone. He was in the forest. Luke's heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around, his eyes wide, his pulse racing. The trees were tall and dark, their branches twisted and gnarled, their trunks covered in thick black moss. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The forest was silent, the only sound the pounding of Luke's heart in his ears. He took a step back, his body trembling, his eyes scanning the darkness. He didn't know how he had gotten here. He didn't know where he was. All he knew was that he needed to get out, needed to find his way back to the village, to safety. But as Luke turned, his eyes darting from one shadow to another, he knew there was no going back. The forest had him now, and it wasn't going to let him go. The whispers started again, soft at first, like a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent, their voices echoing through the darkness. They called to him, urging him to come closer, to step off the path and into the shadows. Luke's breath caught in his throat, his body trembling, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. He took a step back, his eyes wide, his pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, their voices twisting around his mind, pulling at his thoughts, filling his head with images he couldn't understand. Images of darkness, of shadows, of something lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. Luke turned, his feet moving before his mind could catch up, his legs carrying him away from the whispers, away from the shadows. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the forest, the trees blurring around him. He could hear the whispers growing louder, their voices overlapping, merging into a cacophony that filled his mind, drowning out all other sound. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the trees twisting, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, the shadows closing in around him. Luke's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away, had to get out of the forest. But no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he moved, the whispers were always there, just behind him, just beyond the edge of his senses, pulling at him, urging him to come closer, to step off the path and into the darkness. Luke stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell, his body crashing to the ground. He lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. The whispers surrounded him, pressing in on him from all sides, their voices echoing in his mind, filling his thoughts until there was no room for anything else. He closed his eyes, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, his hands still pressed to his ears. The world around him seemed to shift, the ground tilting beneath him, the air growing colder. The whispers twisted around his mind, pulling him deeper into the shadows, into the darkness that waited for him. And then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening, the absence of sound leaving an echo in Luke's mind, a void that seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. He opened his eyes, his hands falling to his sides, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around him had changed. The forest was different now. The trees were taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, their trunks covered in thick black moss. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling around him, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Luke's heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around, his eyes wide, his pulse racing. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how he had gotten here. All he knew was that he needed to get out, needed to find his way back to the village, to safety. But as he turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, he knew there was no going back. The forest had him now, and it wasn't going to let him go. Chapter 8. The Hollow Ones. The darkness in the forest seemed to shift and breathe around Luke as though it were alive. Every movement he made seemed to draw an echo from the shadows, a whisper that flitted past his ear only to vanish before he could grasp it. He stumbled over roots that seemed to grow from nowhere, his legs aching and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had lost all sense of time. Was it hours or days since he had entered this place? Luke felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, a thick blanket that muffled every sound, smothering him. The air felt wrong, heavy and cloying, thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. His head pounded, the whispering voices twisting around his thoughts, urging him deeper into the forest. He had to get away, had to get back to the village, but the more he walked, the more it seemed like he was only getting further from where he needed to be. The whispers had changed. They no longer sounded like wind rustling through leaves. Instead, they carried words that Luke couldn't quite understand but could feel. They whispered secrets, promises, threats. They spoke of a power in the forest, something that waited for him, something that wanted him to come closer. Luke shook his head, his hands pressed to his ears, trying to block out the voices, but it was no use. They were inside him now, winding through his thoughts like vines, wrapping around his mind and squeezing. He stumbled into a clearing, and for a moment there was silence. The whispers fell away, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart in his ears. Luke looked around, his eyes wide. The clearing was empty, just a circle of dead grass surrounded by towering trees, their twisted branches reaching up towards the dark sky like skeletal fingers. In the center of the clearing was a stone, a large flat rock covered in moss and lichen. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, something that drew Luke towards it even as his instincts screamed at him to run. Luke took a step forward, his legs moving of their own accord, his eyes locked on the stone. He could feel something there, something powerful, something ancient. The air around him seemed to hum, the shadows at the edge of the clearing shifting, moving closer. He took another step, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to run, wanted to get away from the clearing, from the stone, from whatever it was that waited for him there, but his body wouldn't listen. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. They urged him forward, told him that he had to touch the stone, that he had to know the truth. Luke shook his head, his body trembling, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to run, but his feet kept moving, carrying him closer and closer to the stone. As he reached the center of the clearing, Luke could feel the air growing colder, the shadows closing in around him. The stone seemed to pulse with energy, a dark light that flickered just beneath its surface. He reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface of the stone. The moment he touched it, the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, the air still, the shadows frozen, and then the ground beneath him shifted. Luke felt the earth tremble, felt the stone pulse beneath his hand. He tried to pull away, but his hand was stuck, his fingers glued to the surface of the stone. The air grew colder still, the shadows closing in, swirling around him, pressing against his skin. He could feel something there, something beneath the stone, something that was waking up. The ground cracked, a deep, echoing sound that reverberated through the clearing. Luke looked down, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. The stone was splitting, a dark light seeping through the cracks, a light that seemed to swallow the darkness, pulling it into itself. The whispers had returned, but now they were different. They were louder, clearer, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Luke could feel them in his mind, could feel them pulling at his thoughts, twisting them, turning them against him. He could see images now, flashes of something dark, something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the stone for centuries. He could see the trees, their twisted branches, their dark roots reaching deep into the earth, wrapping around something that pulsed with power. The ground gave way beneath him, and Luke fell. He tumbled into darkness, the world around him spinning, the whispers growing louder, echoing in his mind. He landed hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, his body aching, his hands scraped and bleeding. He lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Luke pushed himself up, his hands trembling, his legs unsteady. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He was in a cavern, the walls rough and uneven, covered in thick black moss. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay. The whispers were louder now, their voices echoing off the walls. filling the cavern with their sound. In the center of the cavern was a pool, its surface dark and still. Luke could see something there, something beneath the surface, something that moved. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the pool, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. He could feel the whispers pulling him towards it, could feel the darkness wrapping around him, drawing him in. Luke stumbled to the edge of the pool, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. He could see something there, something that was waking up, something that was watching him. The water rippled, the surface breaking, and Luke saw a face, a twisted, hollow face, its eyes dark, its mouth open in a silent scream. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices overlapping, echoing in Luke's mind. He could feel them pulling at him, could feel them urging him to step into the pool, to let the darkness take him. He shook his head, his body trembling, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The face in the pool moved closer, its eyes locked on Luke's, its mouth opening wider, a dark void that seemed to swallow all light. Luke could feel it pulling at him, could feel the darkness wrapping around his thoughts, twisting them, turning them against him. He took a step back, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but it was no use. The darkness was inside him now, the whispers twisting his thoughts, pulling him closer to the pool. Luke fell to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. The whispers were deafening, their voices echoing in his mind, drowning out all other sound. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, could feel the cold water of the pool lapping at his knees, could feel the face in the pool watching him, waiting for him to fall. He opened his eyes, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. The face was gone, the pool still and dark once more. But the whispers remained, their voices softer now, but no less insistent. They told him to get up, to keep moving, to find what lay deeper in the cavern. Luke pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling, his heart pounding. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The cavern stretched out before him, the shadows deep and impenetrable. He could feel something there, something that waited for him, something that wanted him to come closer. He took a step forward, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, the whispers urging him on. He knew he should turn back, knew he should find a way out of the cavern, but the whispers wouldn't let him. They pulled at his thoughts, twisted his mind, urged him to keep moving, to find what lay deeper in the darkness. Luke walked, his footsteps echoing off the cavern walls, the shadows shifting and swirling around him. He could feel the darkness growing thicker, the air colder, the whispers louder. The cavern seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in, the ground sloping downwards, deeper into the earth. The deeper he went, the more the whispers changed. They were no longer just voices. They were images, memories, thoughts that were not his own. Luke could see flashes of people, of faces twisted in fear, of hands reaching out, of eyes wide with terror. He could feel their fear, could feel their desperation, could feel the darkness wrapping around them, pulling them down into the shadows. Luke stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock, and he fell, his body crashing to the ground. He lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, their voices echoing in his mind, filling his thoughts until there was no room for anything else. He pushed himself up, his legs trembling, his heart pounding. He could see something ahead, a light, faint but unmistakable, flickering in the darkness. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the light, the whispers urging him on. He walked, his footsteps echoing off the cavern walls, the light growing brighter with each step. As he reached the light, Luke could see that it was coming from a doorway, a tall, narrow arch carved into the rock. The light flickered, casting long shadows across the cavern floor. Luke took a deep breath, his body trembling, and stepped through the doorway. The room beyond was small, the walls covered in strange symbols, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on the pedestal was a book, its cover dark, its pages yellowed with age. Luke could feel the power radiating from the book, could feel the darkness that surrounded it. could feel the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the book, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. He could feel the whispers urging him on, could feel the darkness wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him closer to the book. He reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers brushing against the cover. The moment he touched it, the whispers stopped. The cavern fell silent, the air still, the shadows frozen. Luke took a deep breath, his body trembling, his eyes locked on the book. He knew that whatever lay within those pages, whatever secrets the book held, it was the key to everything. The key to the whispers, to the darkness, to the forest that had taken hold of his mind. Luke opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages, the symbols twisting and shifting before his eyes. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, could feel the power of the book seeping into his mind, could feel the whispers returning, louder now, more insistent. They told him to read, to understand, to let the darkness take him. And as Luke stood there, the book in his hands, the whispers echoing in his mind, he knew that there was no turning back. The darkness had him now, and it wasn't going to let him go. Chapter 9. The Abyss Within. The book felt heavier than anything Luke had ever held, as though it was not just an object, but a living entity filled with ancient secrets. Its dark energy seemed to pulse through his fingertips, seeping into his veins, sending a cold shiver through his body. The cavern was silent, the oppressive quiet only broken by the rhythmic thud of his heart, echoing in the emptiness. The whispers were gone for the moment, almost as if the forest was waiting for him to make the next move. Luke could sense it, that what lay within the pages would not just reveal secrets but irrevocably change him. His hands trembled as he turned the first page. The brittle paper crinkled under his touch, and Luke found himself staring at symbols, twisting, coiling shapes that seemed to shift beneath his gaze. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, ancient and indecipherable, yet they called to him. He blinked, his eyes blurring as the symbols moved, reshaping themselves, almost alive. Luke could feel something stirring in his mind, a dark presence wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the pages. The book seemed to resonate with a low hum, vibrating in his hands, the sensation reverberating through his bones. The world around him started to dissolve. The cavern walls and their shadows began to melt away, leaving nothing but him, the book, and the darkness within the pages. Luke felt himself being drawn into the abyss, sinking further and further until there was nothing left but the void. And in that void, he saw it. A face, hollow and distorted, its mouth open in an eternal scream. It was watching him, hungry. The face was not just an image. It was a presence that stared through him, devouring his fear, feeding on his thoughts. The whispers returned, louder, more urgent, echoing in his mind, urging him to accept the darkness. They promised power, whispered of understanding that would liberate him. Luke's heart pounded. The weight of those promises pressed against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. The world around him flickered, the cavern shifting, the ground beneath him trembling as if the earth itself was alive. Luke felt himself falling, tumbling through a void filled with twisting symbols and echoing whispers. He reached out, desperate for something to grab onto, but there was nothing. Only emptiness. The hollow face stared at him, eyes dark and bottomless, mouth widening into a void that swallowed everything. And then, he was back in the cavern. The book was still in his hands, the whispers a murmur at the edge of his consciousness. Luke blinked, his eyes struggling to focus on the page. The symbols had shifted into words, words that seemed to speak directly to him, promising freedom, escape, and power beyond his imagination. He could feel their pull, the dark allure of the promises they made. Luke slammed the book shut, gasping for air, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He could feel the darkness all around him, thick and suffocating, a living thing that pressed against his skin. The cavern seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper, and Luke could feel them moving, shifting, something hidden in the darkness, watching, waiting for him to falter. He knew he had to leave. He had to get out, away from the cavern, away from the book, away from the darkness that was slowly consuming him. His feet moved before he could even think, carrying him toward the doorway, away from the pedestal and the book. He stumbled, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding, his mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to escape. The cavern stretched before him, the walls seeming to ripple and twist, the shadows reaching out like skeletal hands clawing at him. The ground sloped downward, deeper into the bowels of the earth, and Luke could feel the temperature dropping, the air growing colder with every step. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty darkness, the whispers following, growing louder, more insistent. They were in his head, twisting his thoughts, turning them into something dark and monstrous. They spoke of power, of secrets buried deep within the earth, secrets that only he could unlock. Luke shook his head violently, his hands pressing against his ears, trying to block them out. But the whispers were relentless, like claws digging into his mind, dragging him back toward the abyss. He stumbled, his foot catching on a jagged rock, and he fell hard, the impact jarring him, pain shooting up his side. He lay there, panting, his hands trembling as they pressed into the cold, damp earth. The whispers surrounded him, coming from every direction, their voices overlapping, growing louder, more demanding. Luke clenched his teeth, trying to force them away, but they were inside him now, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. Pushing himself up, Luke's legs wobbled beneath him, his body unsteady, his heart racing. In the distance, he could see it, a faint light, barely more than a glimmer, but unmistakable. He took a step, then another, his breaths shallow and rapid. The whispers urged him to stop, to stay, to give in, to let the darkness consume him, but Luke fought against them, his eyes locked on that distant light. The light grew brighter as he moved closer, the shadows seeming to shrink away, the whispers fading into the background, their voices still there but quieter, weaker. Luke stumbled forward, his vision narrowing, the cavern twisting around him. He could feel his strength fading, his body on the brink of collapse, but he kept moving, his feet carrying him toward the light, toward hope, toward safety. The opening was there, bright and blinding, the air cool and fresh. Luke could feel it calling to him, urging him on, and he ran, his legs burning, his breath coming in desperate gasps. He stumbled out into the open, collapsing onto the forest floor, the cool air washing over him. He was out. He had escaped. Luke looked up, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the night sky. Stars twinkled above, distant and indifferent, and the dark silhouette of the forest loomed around him. He pushed himself up, his body trembling, his heart pounding. He could still feel it, the darkness, the presence that watched him, that waited for him in the shadows. The book was gone, the cavern was gone, but the darkness remained. The forest was silent, the trees standing tall and still, their twisted branches casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Luke took a step forward, his feet unsteady, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He could feel the forest around him, could feel its gaze, its eyes following his every movement. He knew that he was not safe, that the darkness was still there, lurking, waiting for him to slip, to falter. He took another step, then another, his body trembling, the fear pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the forest, a way back to the village, back to safety. The path ahead was narrow, winding its way through the dense underbrush, the shadows growing thicker with each step. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the air growing colder, the whispers returning, their voices soft, almost gentle, coaxing him to stop, to rest, to give in. Luke shook his head, his eyes focused on the path ahead, his feet moving one in front of the other. He couldn't stop, couldn't let the darkness take him. He had to keep going. The forest seemed endless, the path twisting and turning, the trees towering above, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Luke could feel his strength fading, his legs growing weaker, his steps slowing. The whispers grew louder, urging him to give in, to let go, to become part of the forest. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, could feel it wrapping around his thoughts, clouding his mind. And then he saw it. A light, faint and flickering just ahead. It was small, barely more than a spark, but it was enough. Luke took a deep breath, his body trembling, his heart pounding, and he ran, his feet pounding against the ground, the light growing closer with each step. The whispers grew louder, the darkness pressing in, the forest twisting and shifting around him. But Luke didn't stop. He ran, his eyes locked on the light, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter, the shadows falling away, the whispers fading into nothing. Luke stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, his body collapsing to the ground. He looked up, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. He was out. He had made it. Luke fell to his knees, his body shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could still feel it. The darkness, the presence that lingered, that watched, waiting for the moment he would slip. But he had escaped. He took a deep breath, his eyes closing, his body relaxing. He knew that this wasn't over, that the darkness would always be there, waiting, watching, but for now he was free. As Luke knelt there under the night sky, the forest surrounding him, he knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same. The darkness had touched him, had taken hold of a part of his mind, and it would never let go. It would always be there, a shadow that followed him, a part of him that would never be free. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he fought, he knew that one day the darkness would find him again. And when it did, he would be ready. Luke pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky, his body trembling. He looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above, indifferent to his struggle. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing, his fists clenching at his sides. He had faced the darkness, had survived, and he would keep fighting. He would not let it win. He turned, his eyes scanning the forest, the shadows still there, still shifting, still watching. He could feel the presence, could feel the darkness waiting for him, but he would not give in. He took a step forward, then another, his feet carrying him away from the clearing, away from the whispers, away from the darkness. The forest was still, the night air cold, the path ahead winding through the trees. Luke kept moving, his eyes focused on the distance, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the darkness would always be there, waiting for him, but he also knew that he had the strength to fight it. He would not let it take him, not now, not ever. As he walked, the whispers faded, their voices growing softer, weaker, until they were nothing more than a distant memory. The forest seemed to open up around him, the trees growing less dense, the shadows less oppressive. Luke could see the edge of the forest now, the faint glow of the village lights in the distance. He took a deep breath, his body relaxing, his steps growing steadier. He was almost there, almost free. The darkness had tried to take him, had tried to pull him down into its depths, but he had fought back, had escaped. And as he stepped out of the forest, the village lights shining before him, Luke knew that he was stronger than the darkness, stronger than the whispers, stronger than the fear that had tried to consume him. He had faced the abyss, had looked into the darkness, and he had survived. And no matter what lay ahead, no matter how many times the darkness tried to find him, Luke knew that he would be ready. He would fight, and he would win. Chapter 10. The Depths of Descent. Luke had left the forest behind, but the shadows had followed him. It was in the way the village lights seemed dimmer, the way familiar faces seemed somehow distant. Though he had escaped the physical clutches of the forest, he knew that a piece of it had embedded itself deep within him. It festered there, a dark fragment of the abyss that whispered, echoed, and shifted in the quiet corners of his mind. Luke felt that he was free in body, but a prisoner still in spirit. It was late evening when he finally reached the village. The warm glow from the street lamps fell across his face, but instead of comforting him, it felt foreign, almost threatening. The village had changed, or perhaps it was Luke who had changed. The shadows from the forest seemed to distort everything. He saw fleeting figures in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't be there, lurking behind buildings and trees. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing, just empty air. His own house, usually so familiar and inviting, now seemed like a stranger. He approached the door, the key in his hand trembling as he inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the darkness. Luke stepped inside and felt a chill that seemed to cling to the walls. The air was stagnant, thick with something intangible. He flicked on the lights, but the dim bulbs did little to lift the oppressive atmosphere. He could feel it. The forest was with him, a presence that had followed him, a shadow that had slipped in through the doorway. Luke moved through his house like a stranger, his footsteps hesitant, each creak of the floorboards causing him to flinch. He knew that he was alone, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows. It was irrational, he told himself, a trick of the mind, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. The whispers had gone silent for now, but the silence felt worse. It was the kind of silence that held potential, a breath held before the plunge. He entered his bedroom, the bed unmade, the sheets rumpled from the last time he had slept there. How many days had it been? It felt like a lifetime. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. The book, it wasn't here, but it felt as though it was. He could almost see it, the ancient symbols shifting, calling to him, whispering promises that were as dark as the shadows that had chased him from the forest. He closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath, trying to push away the thoughts that clawed at his mind. But the darkness remained, lingering in the corners of his consciousness. He could feel it, as if it were something alive, something that moved when he wasn't looking. Luke opened his eyes, his gaze drawn to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing there, watching him. Luke blinked, and it was gone. He let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get out of the house, needed to escape the confines of these walls that seemed to close in on him. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the window. He pulled aside the curtain, looking out into the night. The village was still, the streets empty, the world outside silent. But there, just beyond the edge of the lamplight, he saw them, the shadows. They were waiting for him. He turned away from the window, his hands trembling. He needed to clear his head, needed to escape the suffocating feeling that had taken hold of him. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and left the house, the door slamming shut behind him. The night air was cold, biting against his skin, but it felt better than the oppressive warmth of his home. He walked, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets, his eyes scanning the shadows, always looking for something that he couldn't quite see. Luke wandered through the village, his mind a haze of fear and confusion. He could hear things, soft whispers that seemed to come from the darkened alleyways, from behind closed doors, from the shadows that moved just out of sight. They were the same whispers that had haunted him in the forest, the same voices that had promised power and freedom, that had urged him to embrace the darkness. He found himself at the edge of the village, where the houses gave way to fields, and beyond that, the forest. Luke stopped, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees that loomed in the distance. He could feel it, the pull of the forest, the way it called to him, the way it whispered his name. It was as if the forest was alive, a living entity that had reached out to him, taken hold of him, and was now trying to pull him back. Luke shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. He couldn't go back. He knew that. The forest was darkness. It was madness, and he had barely escaped with his life. But even now, standing there at the edge of the village, he could feel the pull, the dark allure of the shadows that waited for him. He took a step back, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. He had to get away, had to leave before it was too late. But as he turned, he heard something. A rustle of leaves, a whisper carried on the wind. Luke froze, his eyes wide, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked back at the forest, his gaze scanning the darkness, and there, just beyond the edge of the trees, he saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing there, watching him. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the darkness, and Luke felt his heart seize in his chest. He stumbled back, his feet slipping on the grass, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, but Luke could feel its gaze. could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him. It was the forest. It had come for him. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, urging him to come back, to return to the darkness, to let it take him. Luke turned and ran, his feet pounding against the ground, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. He could hear the whispers following him, could feel the presence of the figure behind him, could feel the darkness closing in. He ran through the village, his eyes wide, his heart pounding, the world around him a blur of shadows and light. He didn't stop until he reached his house, the door slamming shut behind him, his body collapsing against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were gone, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Luke closed his eyes, his body trembling, his mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. He knew that the forest was still there, waiting for him, that it would never let him go. He could feel it, the darkness that had taken hold of him, the shadows that had followed him from the forest. They were a part of him now, a shadow that would always be there, a darkness that would never let him go. Days passed, but time had lost its meaning. Luke moved through his days in a daze, his mind clouded, the whispers always there, just at the edge of his thoughts. He could feel the darkness growing stronger, could feel it wrapping around his mind, pulling at him, urging him to return to the forest. He tried to fight it, tried to push it away, but it was no use. The darkness was inside him, a part of him, and no matter how hard he fought, he knew that he was losing. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the whispers echoing in his mind. He would look around, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short gasps, and he would see them, the shadows. They were always there, moving in the corners of his vision, slipping away when he turned to look directly. They were patient, waiting for him to slip, waiting for the moment when he would give in. Luke knew he couldn't stay in the village. The forest was calling to him, and he could feel his resolve crumbling, could feel the pull growing stronger with each passing day. He had to leave, had to get as far away from the forest as possible. He packed a bag, his hands trembling, his heart pounding. He didn't know where he would go, only that he had to leave, had to escape the shadows that had taken hold of him. But as he stood at the edge of the village, his bag slung over his shoulder, Luke felt a chill run through him. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, its twisted branches reaching up towards the sky like skeletal fingers. He could hear the whispers, soft and insistent, calling to him, urging him to come back. He closed his eyes, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had to leave, he had to get away, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen, the whispers growing louder, more demanding. Luke opened his eyes, his gaze drawn to the forest, and there, at the edge of the trees, he saw them, the figures, dark and indistinct, their eyes glowing faintly, watching him, waiting for him to return. Luke felt his heart seize in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He took a step back, then another, his body trembling, his mind screaming at him to run, to get away. But the whispers were too strong, the pull of the forest too powerful. He could feel it, the darkness wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him towards the forest, towards the figures that waited for him. Luke shook his head, his hands pressed to his ears, trying to block out the whispers, but it was no use. The figures moved closer, their forms shifting, the shadows swirling around them. Luke could feel their gaze, could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. He took another step back, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps, but he knew it was too late. The forest had him, the darkness had him. Luke turned, his feet moving of their own accord, carrying him towards the forest, towards the figures that waited for him. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together, a cacophony that filled his mind, drowning out all other thought. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, could feel it pulling him down, deeper and deeper into the abyss. The trees loomed above him, their branches twisted and gnarled, their roots reaching out like claws. The forest was silent, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Luke could feel the darkness pressing in on him, could feel the shadows wrapping around him, pulling him down into the depths of the forest. He knew that there was no escape, that the forest had claimed him, that the darkness would never let him go. As he stepped into the forest, the whispers fell silent, the world around him still and silent, the darkness complete. Luke closed his eyes, his breath coming in slow, steady gasps, and he let the darkness take him. He was no longer afraid. The forest was a part of him, and he was a part of it. The shadows that had followed him, the whispers that had haunted him, they were his now, and he was theirs. Luke opened his eyes, the darkness surrounding him, the figures standing before him, their eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. He could feel their presence, could feel the power that radiated from them, could feel the darkness that bound them all together. He took a step forward, then another, his body moving with a purpose that was no longer his own. The forest was alive, the darkness a living entity that pulsed with energy, that flowed through him, through the figures, through the trees. Luke could feel it, could feel the power of the forest, the weight of its ancient knowledge, the dark secrets that it held. He knew that he was no longer just Luke. He was something more, something greater, something that was a part of the forest, a part of the darkness. And as Luke walked deeper into the forest, the shadows closing in around him, the whispers returning, he knew that he was finally home. The darkness had taken him, had claimed him, and he had embraced it. The forest was his, and he was the forest. The abyss had swallowed him, and he had become one with it. And in the depths of the forest, in the heart of the darkness, Luke found peace. Epilogue. The Whispering Woods. The village spoke of Luke in hushed tones. They said he had been restless, haunted by something unseen, and that he had disappeared one night into the forest, never to return. Some claimed they had seen his silhouette at the edge of the woods, a dark figure watching from the shadows, waiting. Others spoke of whispers carried on the wind, voices that called to them in the dead of night, urging them to step into the forest. The forest itself seemed different now, darker, more alive, its shadows deeper, its presence heavier. The villagers knew better than to wander too close. They spoke of the forest as if it were a living entity, something that had grown hungry, something that had claimed one of their own and was waiting for more. On moonless nights when the sky was dark and the wind blew through the trees, they could hear it, the whispers. Faint and distant, they carried across the fields, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of their world. The villagers would close their windows, lock their doors, and pray that the forest would stay where it belonged. But deep within the forest, where the light of the village could not reach, Luke walked among the trees, the darkness his only companion. He was no longer afraid, no longer haunted by the whispers, for he had become one with them. The forest was his home, the shadows his family, and the darkness his solace. And so, the forest remained, a dark and mysterious presence on the edge of the village, a place where the brave dared not tread. And within its depths, Luke waited, a guardian of the shadows, a keeper of the whispers, forever bound to the forest and the darkness that had claimed him.